43 years ago, a 20-year-old young man in St. Louis stepped out of his house on a fall evening and vanished without a trace, leaving his family plunged into grief and a community bewildered for decades. Authorities once suspected a local electrician might be involved, but with what seemed like a rock-solid alibi and virtually no leads to follow, the investigation hit a complete dead end. Yet through all those years, Daniel Whitford's family never gave up hope, clinging to the faint belief that one day the truth would come to light. Then one day, when modern technology, combined with a long-lost 1981 case file and a witness who suddenly reappeared, a detail overlooked for 4 decades, suddenly surfaced, a detail powerful enough to turn the entire case in a direction no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy content like this, don't forget to hit subscribe. Night fell over North St. Louis in early October 1981, with an unusually early chill for that time of year. The yellow sodium streetlights along the road looked blurred by the thin layer of fog drifting close to the ground, making every movement seem hazy and distant. In that flickering light, sometime early in the evening, the Whitford family's front door opened, and 20-year-old Daniel Whitford stepped outside in his familiar way. Back straight, denim jacket zipped up across his chest, backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. The warm yellow glow from the living room spilled out behind him with every step, then slowly retreated, as though the house itself was trying to hold on to something no one yet realized was important. Someone later recalled that Daniel turned his head slightly back toward the house for a moment, not because he'd forgotten anything, but out of habit to check that the door was shut. His mother was still in the kitchen, and she only caught a glimpse of her son's tall, thin silhouette on the pavement before it melted into the streetlights. Across the street, Mr. Harrelson, the neighbor who had lived in Baden for over 30 years, saw Daniel walk past his house. He clearly remembered the soft clack of the young man's old sneakers on the damp sidewalk, and the way Daniel hunched his shoulders against a sudden cold gust blowing up from the Mississippi River. There was nothing in Daniel's stride or expression to suggest anything was wrong. He wasn't hurrying, nor did he look wary. Just a young man heading to his evening shift in a neighborhood he passed through every day. A woman who lived near the Halls Ferry Road turnoff remembered one other detail. She saw Daniel walk into the narrow side street that led down to the local shopping area, passing the faded red brick wall of an old building, then disappearing around the corner. She heard no car, saw no one walking close beside him. The figure, at first sharp under the yellow light, simply faded, then vanished completely, as if swallowed by the darkness behind the row of shops that had closed early. And from that moment on, no one ever saw Daniel Whitford again. As the clock ticked toward midnight, inside the small Whitford home, anxiety began to spread like water overflowing its banks. Daniel's mother paced the living room, eyes fixed on the window. His father stood by the rotary phone, flipping through the phone book and calling Daniel's workplace, only to be told the young man had never shown up for his shift. Daniel's younger sister tried a few of his close friends. Each call ended with the same answer: "I haven't seen Daniel since this afternoon." Time dragged unbearably slowly. Every minute without news felt like an hour. Outside, the north wind picked up, rattling the porch roof and whistling against the window frames, turning the normally cozy house strangely cold. The family took turns opening the front door to peer down the street, hoping to spot that familiar figure at the end of the block. But the street stayed silent, long and empty. Even the sound of a passing car was enough to spark hope, hope that died again and again until the silence itself became a deep, soaking fear. Finally, when the clock passed 1 in the morning, the unease could no longer be ignored. No one believed Daniel would simply disappear on his own. His father picked up the phone, hands trembling slightly but resolute. He dialed the police, his voice dropping to just 3 words: "My son is missing." Less than 10 minutes after the family hung up, a St. Louis Police Department patrol car was dispatched to the Baden neighborhood for the initial welfare check. By then the streets were almost deserted, only thin ribbons of white fog drifting low over the pavement, and the endless whisper of wind sweeping past the streetlights. A young adult not coming home at night wasn't rare in the city, but the family's description, total silence, no attempt at contact, and the fact Daniel had never run away before, prompted the duty officer to mark the report higher priority than usual. Patrol officers Kane and Merrow were assigned to canvass the three main routes Daniel might have taken toward Union Station. Inside the cruiser they spread out a paper map and circled the likely travel radius based on the Whitford home and the nearest bus stop. 10 minutes later they started driving the main road where the neighbor had last seen Daniel, scanning every stretch of sidewalk and every dark alley. Parked cars were briefly checked with flashlights. No signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, nothing to suggest Daniel had encountered immediate danger. Yet Officer Kane felt something was off on a night this cold. Both the bus stop and sidewalk were oddly free of fresh footprints, only a few smudged marks blurred by the wind. They continued deeper toward Branch Street, a quieter stretch lined with old warehouses and early closing shops. Just after 3:20 a.m., as the cruiser turned the corner, its headlights swept across a car parked tight against the curb. Officer Merrow immediately recognized the license plate from the family's description. It was Daniel Whitford's light-colored Chevrolet. The car was parked crooked, front tire almost touching the grass strip, as if the driver had braked hard or left in a hurry. Officer Kane got out first, leaned toward the driver's door, and gently tried the handle. The door opened instantly, unlocked. That alone felt completely wrong. The family had stressed that Daniel always locked his car, even for a quick stop. Inside, things weren't chaotic, but the subtle wrongness was unmistakable. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than necessary for someone Daniel's height. The driver's side window was cracked open a couple of inches despite the freezing night, and the radio was tuned to a soft country station that, according to his mother, my son would never listen to. There was no trash or obvious struggle on the floorboards, but the misplaced seat made Officer Kane wonder whether Daniel had even been the one to drive the car here. Officer Merrow shone his flashlight around the area. The sidewalk was clean, no clear footprints remaining. The constant cold wind erased small details fast. Still, he noted one thing: the car's location lay well outside Daniel's normal route. To reach Union Station from Baden, Daniel needed to head south. Branch Street veered sharply east and downhill toward a small shopping area long closed for the night. There was no clear reason for Daniel to drive here himself, and even less reason to abandon the car on a nearly deserted street in the middle of the night. Officer Kane carefully closed the door, marked the location, and radioed headquarters that they had located the missing person's vehicle. His voice over the radio was steady but heavy. "We found the vehicle. No sign of the subject." From inside the cruiser, Officer Merrow began drafting the initial scene report, writing in clear letters, "Vehicle discovered in a location inconsistent with the missing subject's expected route." At that moment neither officer could know that the car's strange placement would become the pivotal clue sending the entire case in a completely different direction. But right then they both understood one thing: Daniel Whitford hadn't simply missed his shift or fallen asleep somewhere. Something had interrupted his journey, and the abandoned car on the empty street was only the first sign that this disappearance might no longer be just a young man getting lost. Officers Kane and Merrow activated their light bar, cordoned off a small radius, and requested additional units. The official search had quietly shifted into a more serious, heavier phase full of questions that for now had no answers. When backup units arrived, and the area around the Chevrolet was secured with yellow tape, Officers Kane and Merrow handed the scene over to the SLMPD forensic team. Dawn was still hours away, and the fog hadn't lifted, making the patrol car lights look choked in the gloomy air. The 1981 forensics team didn't have the sophisticated tools of later decades, no DNA analysis, no automated footwear databases, but they still worked the scene as thoroughly as possible. Wide shots, close-ups of the doors, handles, driver's seat, gear shift, and every surface that might hold evidence. The first thing noted in the log was the car's condition: unlocked, driver window cracked, seat pushed back so far that if Daniel sat there, his feet would barely reach the pedals. An older technician muttered, "How tall is this 20-year-old?" Officer Kane answered, "About 5'10". The technician glanced at the seat again, and shook his head. "This position isn't right. Someone taller sat here." That observation was recorded as an anomaly, but in 1981, it wasn't enough to prove anything beyond the strong likelihood someone else had moved the car. Inside, there were no signs of a fight or broken items. Everything looked too clean, too ordinary, and that very ordinariness felt chilling because it didn't match the time and circumstances of the abandonment. On the passenger seat, police found a folded paper map of St. Louis, old but neat. The family later confirmed Daniel never used a map for his commute. He'd taken the same route for years. The map didn't belong to him. A new question formed: if the map wasn't Daniel's, who put it there, and why? The radio still played faint country music, completely out of place on the silent street. Daniel's family had already stated he didn't listen to country. Legally it meant nothing, but in a missing person case, any offbeat detail could open a new avenue. The glove box yielded routine items, random papers, tissues, a week-old soda receipt, but was missing one thing Daniel's mother distinctly remembered: the small backpack he'd carried when he left the house. It wasn't in the car. The floor mats held no obvious debris or mud, yet the carpet under the driver's seat showed a fine reddish-brown dust unlike the usual street dirt in Baden. A technician collected a sample, sealed it, and labeled it for possible future comparison, though in 1981, they had no real way to analyze it yet. What struck Officer Kane most was the car's silence. No spare key, no note, nothing to indicate Daniel had willingly left and gone elsewhere. The vehicle felt hastily abandoned, yet lacked the usual traces of haste. When they opened the rear door, they found a single long dark hair lying alone on the seat. No one knew whose it was. DNA testing didn't exist in 1981, so they simply noted that the hair did not match Daniel and placed it in a paper evidence bag per protocol. Another small but notable detail: the dome light was on, as if someone had opened the door in the dark and forgotten to switch it off. Daniel always turned everything off before leaving the car. This added to the growing suspicion that the vehicle had been tampered with by someone else, possibly shortly after Daniel disappeared. Officer Kane tried to picture the scenario. Did Daniel drive here? Was he stopped? Or did someone else bring the car and ditch it? None of the theories fit perfectly, because Daniel's commute had nothing to do with Branch Street. When the preliminary examination ended, the summary report sent to headquarters carried a short but weighty conclusion: vehicle recovered. Evidence inconsistent with subject's typical travel pattern. Unknown individual, may have operated vehicle. In other words, Daniel's car had been abandoned by someone who was not Daniel. And that raised the most critical question of the early search: if he didn't drive the car here, where was Daniel when the car stopped on that empty street? No one had an answer, and the silence of the abandoned Chevrolet in pre-dawn St. Louis only deepened the void left by Daniel Whitford's disappearance. Once the Chevrolet was towed to the impound lot, and Branch Street was cleared of police tape, investigators moved into the next crucial phase: reconstructing Daniel Whitford's final movements. In missing person cases, especially urban nighttime disappearances, retracing the victim's path can reveal unnatural gaps, those off-schedule minutes that often signal outside interference. For Daniel, the initial gap appeared extremely short. So short, it felt fundamentally incompatible with the normal behavior of a young man heading to a night shift. Officer Kane spread a well-worn St. Louis map across the temporary conference table. He marked the Whitford home in Baden with red ink, then circled Union Station. Daniel's daily route, as described by the family, was a fixed habit: turn onto the main road, follow Hall's Ferry Road, through a few busy neighborhoods, then merge onto the direct artery downtown. Travel time, whether driving or getting a ride, always fell between 18 and 20 minutes, depending on traffic. Everything was routine, uneventful, and offered no reason for Daniel to deviate. Yet the car had been found in the opposite direction. Branch Street lay far to the east, completely off the path Daniel needed. Officer Merrow wrote in the file, "Subject's travel path deviates from the expected route, without known motivation." The question became, did Daniel turn that way himself, or was he forced to? They broke the route into segments and calculated the disappearance window using neighbor statements. Mr. Harrelson saw Daniel just before 7 o'clock, while faint dusk light remained. The woman near the shopping area saw Daniel's silhouette turn into the side street only minutes later. The interval between sightings was no more than 5 minutes, and if Daniel had kept walking, he should have emerged on the other side of the shops within another few minutes. But he never did. Roughly 14 minutes after the first sighting, based on patrol timing and landmarks, Daniel had vanished from any reasonable line of sight. A 14-minute gap, too brief to believe, yet long enough for something terrible to happen if the right or wrong person was in the right place. When investigators re-interviewed the woman near the shopping area about that exact moment, she hesitated. She said that in the dim streetlight and thick fog she thought she saw Daniel pause, appearing to speak with someone before turning into the alley. She wasn't sure if the other figure was standing still or moving, male or female, only that the shape was fairly tall and close to the brick wall. "I might be mistaken," she added. The fog was heavy that night, but her hesitation became the first faint clue suggesting Daniel had not been alone just before he vanished. If someone really was waiting for him, why? And if Daniel was intercepted, did he know the person? Those questions grew more urgent when Officer Merrow cross-referenced Daniel's intended route. He had no reason to turn into that alley to reach Union Station. Doing so actually took him farther from the main road. Something, or someone must have made him alter course at least a few dozen yards, a familiar voice calling his name, someone asking for help, or a situation that temporarily changed his path. They marked the map from home to the first sighting, then to the spot where Daniel turned into the alley, then to the expected emergence point behind the shops. But the trail ended abruptly with no continuation. It was as if a film reel had been cut the instant the main character stepped out of frame. Most telling, that gap coincided with heavy fog, patchy streetlight, and a shopping strip already shuttered for the night. In other words, the perfect window and location for someone to approach Daniel unnoticed. A younger detective suggested Daniel might have run into an acquaintance and stopped briefly. Officer Kane shot it down. If it was someone he knew, he would have mentioned it recently. The family says no new contacts lately. That sparked a different theory. The person waiting, if there was one, didn't have to be close to Daniel. A simple question, a quiet call of his name, or a minor distraction could have made him pause for seconds, and those seconds could rewrite an entire night. Digging deeper, Officer Merrow realized that if Daniel was stopped, or led just a few steps behind the corner, the encounter could easily go unseen. The narrow, dimly lit alley and high brick walls would hide any movement. 14 minutes, Merrow repeated, too short to get far, but too long to disappear without a trace. That line later made it into the summary, because it captured the case's early essence perfectly. A brief but deeply mysterious interval in which Daniel may have walked into an encounter no one could have foreseen. Still, every analysis circled back to one fact: Daniel didn't vanish at the end of his commute. He vanished in the very first minutes of the evening, in a place he believed was familiar and safe. And the car found in the completely opposite direction only tangled the picture further. Someone, or something had altered Daniel's route, or the route had altered him in a way no one saw coming. The team knew they needed more. They needed witnesses, physical evidence, anything to fill those 14 minutes. But on the morning Daniel was officially reported missing, that gap remained only a solid black streak across the St. Louis map, no exit, no light, and no explanation. Dawn was just breaking when the SLMPD search and rescue team was mobilized to Branch Street. The early light fell across the low rooftops and drab gray warehouses, giving the neighborhood a cold, unfamiliar look, nothing like the atmosphere people remembered from the night before. The yellow tape still stretched around the spot where the Chevrolet had been found, and in the murky glow of sunrise, those strips looked like fragile warnings separating the familiar part of St. Louis from the mysterious zone Daniel had vanished into hours earlier. The K-9 unit got the first assignment: establish Daniel's scent trail and determine whether he had walked away from the car on foot. The hair recovered from the back seat and a shirt from the Whitford home were used to provide the scent sample. The tracking dog, a veteran German shepherd named Jasper, sniffed the items, then began working slow, deliberate circles around the vehicle. At first Jasper seemed confused. He didn't lock onto a single direction the way he normally did in missing person cases. He turned his head several times, sniffing in and out of the car, then suddenly pulled hard toward the narrow alley across from Branch Street. The handlers and investigators followed immediately, crossing the empty roadway and moving into the tight space between two rows of buildings. The alley sloped gently downward and opened into a wider area of vacant lots, a few rusted metal door warehouses, and industrial dumpsters. This was not a place Daniel had any reason to enter. The area was used mostly by delivery drivers or maintenance workers. Jasper tracked about 70 feet before he abruptly stopped, swung his head sideways, and changed direction completely. He pulled his handler toward an adjacent lot where several empty shipping containers sat abandoned. But as they neared the containers, Jasper circled again, lost focus, and acted as though he could no longer pinpoint the end of the trail. One investigator knelt and touched the ground. The area had taken a hard gust of wind from the east overnight, wind that funneled through the alleys and could scatter scent in every direction. Officer Kane watched from a distance and realized this was highly unusual. If Daniel had left the car on foot here, the scent should have led in one clear direction. Instead, Jasper kept switching, as though multiple overlapping trails were interfering. Scents contaminated, Jasper's handler said almost exactly when Kane thought the same thing. Wind last night was too strong. Plus you've got transients moving through here. Branch Street wasn't far from spots where homeless people sometimes took shelter on cold nights. Human odors mixed together and ruined the dog's accuracy, a problem every search team dreaded. Still, Jasper reacted strongly when they approached one long-shuttered warehouse. The investigators immediately shone flashlights through the gaps, but inside there was nothing except empty wooden crates and thick cobwebs. No fresh footprints, no sign anyone had been staying there. After circling the building once, Jasper lost all interest entirely and returned to a neutral state. That only reinforced the conclusion that the wind had swirled and mixed the scent too much to follow in any single direction. The search widened from Branch Street outward along 3 adjacent roads, then into the small shopping area where the woman had last seen Daniel. They checked warehouse back doors, loading docks, fire escapes, even the narrow gaps leading to old shop basements. Every location was lit up, photographed, and logged, but everything pointed to the same answer: no clear evidence Daniel had walked away from the car or been taken through here. A younger detective asked, what if Daniel left the car earlier and someone else drove it here? Or what if he was never near this spot when the car was parked? That question made Officer Merrow look at the whole area again. Branch Street was too quiet, too disconnected from Daniel's commute. Even a lost 20-year-old wouldn't choose this route, especially at night. When Jasper couldn't pick up a continuing trail, and none of the exits showed matching evidence, search and rescue had to expand the grid to almost a 2-mile radius. They checked small parks, underpasses, even the edge of Calvary Cemetery, but everything ran into the same invisible wall. Daniel had left no trace along any path, while the car had somehow materialized in a place it had no business being. By nearly noon, the teams paused to compile data. One by one they had to admit the morning search hadn't brought them a single step closer to Daniel. The car remained the only solid clue, yet it pointed nowhere. It offered no next direction, no place Daniel might have left the street. Standing in the crisp St. Louis air, Officers Kane and Merrow and the rest of the search team understood they were dealing with more than an ordinary missing person case. This was a sudden, clean, almost too clean disappearance that left not even a single piece to connect to the picture growing fainter by the hour. The search continued, but everyone knew the case had already slipped into a shadow zone, where every path led only to dead ends. With the morning search yielding almost nothing, and Jasper's scent trail unable to point anywhere definitive, investigators moved to the next standard step in a missing person case: canvassing witnesses within the area Daniel was last seen. This is always the hardest part, because human memory, especially in dim light, thick fog, and from a distance, is far from a perfect recording device. Yet sometimes those scattered fragments open new doors. Officers Kane and Merrow started with the first neighbor who reported seeing Daniel, Mr. Harrelson. In a taped interview the following morning, he repeated exactly what he had said the night before. Daniel was walking normally. No one beside him, nothing to suggest trouble. When asked if he noticed anyone nearby, he answered, no. The block was dead quiet that night. His statement was consistent and contained nothing suspicious. But when police widened the canvas to the apartments facing the small shopping area, where the second witness had claimed to see Daniel turn in, the story began to show tiny cracks, the kind of gaps a disappearance can easily slip through. The second witness, Ella Martins, a middle-aged woman who lived on the second floor of an old brick building, said she saw Daniel appear to stop and talk to someone. She described the other person as male, a little taller than Daniel, wearing a long dark coat. But when Officer Kane pressed, "Are you certain it was a man?" she hesitated. "I think so, but there was a lot of fog. I only saw the shape. I could be wrong." The interviewing officer noted clearly, witness uncertain of second person's gender, certain only that Daniel was not walking alone when he entered the alley. That supported the theory Daniel had been intercepted or approached, but because Ella couldn't describe more, the lead remained a vague silhouette under a street lamp. The real complication came when Officer Merrow knocked on doors along the storefronts facing the alley, and met a third witness with a completely different account. This one, Amanda Leary, said that around the same time she saw Daniel walking with a blonde woman in a light-colored coat. Kane followed up, "You're sure it was Daniel?" She nodded, saying she recognized his walk and denim jacket, because Daniel sometimes stopped at the convenience store where she worked. But her description of the companion bore no resemblance to Ella Martin's account, not gender, not height, not hair color, not clothing, not demeanor. Officer Kane asked, "Did you hear them say anything?" Amanda answered, "No, but they weren't arguing. They were walking pretty close, like they were going the same way." This was the biggest problem for the investigation. Two descriptions so contradictory, they could not both be true. One said Daniel stopped to talk to a tall man in a dark coat. The other said Daniel walked beside a blonde woman in a light coat. When timelines were compared, both witnesses were confident their sightings fell within the minutes Daniel turned toward the shopping area. The two women did not know each other, and had no reason to coordinate stories, yet their statements felt like descriptions of two entirely separate scenes. Police considered a third possibility. Both witnesses saw the same person, but fog and sodium lighting distorted features. Officer Merrow noted, however, that the sightings were minutes apart, not simultaneous, making that explanation unlikely. Another theory floated: Daniel may have encountered two different people in a very short window, but that contradicted the search results, which showed no evidence of multiple people in the area. Most important, no witness could say Daniel appeared frightened, or tried to get away from whoever was with him. No shouting, no running, no gestures signaling danger. Everything looked normal. An unnatural kind of normal. Ella admitted she only saw backs, never faces. Amanda remembered the blonde hair clearly, because it caught the orange streetlight. The accounts were too opposed to merge, and too sincere to dismiss either as fabrication. Officers Kane and Merrow sat in the cruiser staring at the two interview transcripts side by side. The only thing they could be certain of was that Daniel had not been completely alone when he walked into that alley. Who he was with, and why, remained unknown. There was even a chance the witnesses had seen unrelated pedestrians at the same moment, and mistakenly attached them to Daniel. When the early data was compiled, car abandoned in the wrong location, contaminated canine track, and two irreconcilable witness statements, the case began to resemble a maze with no path to the center, only loops around the city's dark corners. A veteran detective summed it up: if this disappearance was planned, whoever did it picked the perfect blind spot in the neighborhood. And he was right. No matter how hard they tried, no one could figure out how Daniel had left that patch of darkness, or whether he had left it at all. With conflicting witness statements about the person or persons seen with Daniel unable to narrow the investigation, the team had to return to the most basic step: screening every personal work and recent contact in Daniel's life. A disappearance can stem from conflict, a new relationship, a misunderstanding, or even stalking, All had to be checked, especially when there was no indication Daniel had voluntarily walked away from his life. Officers Kane and Merrow started at Daniel's job at Union Station. Co-workers described him as quiet and even-tempered, someone who rarely clashed with anyone. But one casual remark from a co-worker who shared Daniel's shift caught both detectives' attention. The young man Marcus recalled that about 2 weeks before Daniel vanished, Daniel had mentioned some stranger standing in front of the house several nights in a row. When Kane dug deeper, Marcus said Daniel told the story half-jokingly, as if he didn't take it completely seriously, but not casually enough to ignore entirely. Daniel hadn't described the person beyond saying the figure stood near the streetlight, across from the house, not doing anything, just looking. Marcus thought Daniel was mostly kidding, or that it was just someone who happened to pause there. But now, matched against the fragments from the night witnesses, a figure by the brick wall, someone walking or talking with Daniel in the dark alley, Marcus's story suddenly carried more weight. Officer Merrow asked, "Did Daniel say how many times this person showed up?" Marcus frowned, thinking, "He said 3 or 4 nights, something like that. Always in the same spot, right under the light." Marcus added that Daniel didn't know who it was, and never mentioned the person trying to approach or act threatening. Still, the fact a stranger had repeatedly appeared near Daniel's home for no explained reason was a piece that could not be ignored. When asked why he hadn't mentioned it sooner, Marcus went quiet, then said, "I didn't think it mattered." Until now, police returned to the Baden neighborhood to verify with neighbors. They asked Mr. Harrelson, the last person to see Daniel near the house, if he had ever noticed anyone standing by that streetlight for several nights. Harrelson was genuinely surprised, and insisted he had never seen anyone, especially late at night. Another neighbor, Mrs. Holt, who often left her kitchen window open in the evenings, also said she had never noticed any stranger lingering near the block. That left 2 unfavorable possibilities. Either Daniel had encountered someone he hadn't told his family or neighbors much about, or this mysterious figure only appeared when no one else was watching, or deliberately chose moments to avoid being seen. Officer Kane wrote, "Possible stalker or unknown observer, no visual confirmation from neighborhood." But the biggest question immediately followed: if someone really had been watching Daniel, why, and why didn't Daniel seem clearly afraid? The timing of the stranger's appearances, according to Marcus, also suspiciously overlapped with Daniel's recent shift change preparations, which often had him leaving home earlier, or returning later, perfect windows for someone to establish a surveillance pattern. The investigation widened to Daniel's broader social circle. Friends all gave similar portraits: no conflicts, no debts, no recent arguments or trouble. None of them knew who the stranger by the house might be. One old high school friend remembered Daniel mentioning meeting someone at the school library a few weeks earlier, a man who asked for directions too many times, and it creeped Daniel out. But when pressed for details, the friend couldn't recall the man's face, only that Daniel later said, "The guy just kept staring at me." Again, the descriptions were too vague to identify anyone. No distinct height, hair color, vehicle, or exact location. Just someone, a guy, I think a man. It left Kane and Merrow feeling they were chasing a shadow that stayed just out of the streetlight, visible enough to worry about, but not solid enough to grab. When they compiled the day's statements, they noticed one troubling pattern. The night of witnesses also described Daniel talking to someone before he turned into the alley. Though the descriptions of the companion didn't match, the single common thread was critical: Daniel had not been entirely alone in his final sighted moments. A stranger had watched Daniel from across the street days earlier, per Marcus. A possible male figure talked to Daniel the night he vanished, per Ella. A blonde woman walked beside him, per Amanda. No description matched another. No lead became solid. But in missing person investigations, when every path is foggy, repeated irregularity, even incomplete, is often a sign the core of the problem lies there, with an unknown person no one ever really saw clearly. Officer Kane's final note read, "Possible pattern, victim observed prior to disappearance." No matches to known associates, but at that point, they could go no further. There still wasn't enough to identify whoever had been watching Daniel, much less prove that person was connected to the abandoned car. So the lead impossible to dismiss, was filed under unverified, a figure standing just outside the light, a question mark hanging in the air, a clue not yet attachable to the case yet, impossible to pretend didn't exist. Weeks turned into months after Daniel disappeared, with no clear progress. By early 1982 the case was officially classified, missing circumstances unknown, but investigators quietly kept chasing even the smallest leads. It was during this stretch that the first strange signals appeared: anonymous phone calls, messages with no sender, vague fragments that seemed about to reveal something, only to dissolve against the wall of dead ends surrounding Daniel's case. The first tip came on an April afternoon in 1982. The station received an anonymous call from a man whose voice was hoarse and low, as if deliberately distorted. He said only one sentence: "Check the basement of the house at 214 Lundy." Then he hung up. No background noise, no breathing, nothing to trace. Officers Kane and Merrow obtained a warrant the same day. When they entered the long vacant house, the damp, musty air and smell of rotting wood hit them harder than usual. Windows were boarded shut. Everything inside was covered in thick dust. They descended the creaky wooden stairs to the basement, half expecting the steps to collapse under their weight. The basement, contrary to their gut feeling, was completely empty. No suspicious items, no sign of recent human presence, nothing tied to Daniel. The only thing they noted was a strange colored streak in the concrete floor, but testing showed it was only rust from old barrels. Conclusion: false lead. The call was logged, but the caller was never identified. In July 1983, another call came in. Longer this time. The caller was a woman, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I know Daniel," she said. "I think I saw him a few weeks ago down south in the city. He was with someone." Before Officer Merrow could ask for her name, the line went dead. They called back the number that showed on the call log. It didn't exist. Even knowing such calls could be mistaken identity or false memory, the detail with someone made it impossible to ignore completely. Still, when they checked the area she mentioned, no one recognized Daniel, and no notable reports. Another faint trail blown away by the wind. Then in early 1984, the strangest things began to surface. In the police department mailbox appeared an envelope with no return address. Inside was only a scrap of old newspaper on which two words were scrawled in black marker: "Ask the electrician." Nothing else. No name, no address, no explanation. A message so blunt it felt crude, yet it made the detectives pause longer than usual. Officer Kane stared at the paper and frowned. Electrician? Which electrician? No one in Daniel's file worked as an electrician. No family member mentioned Daniel ever arguing with one. No neighbor ever pointed to anyone in the electrical trade who had watched Daniel. Yet the phrase "ask the electrician" felt deliberately aimed at something real they hadn't seen yet. With no data to tie it to the case, the scrap was filed under unverified information. But in Officer Merrow's mind a seed of suspicion had been planted. Someone knew something about Daniel. Someone wanted police to look toward an electrician. But right around the same time, a flood of other anonymous tips poured in, as if the people of St. Louis had suddenly been swept into an uncontrollable storm of rumors. A man called to say he had seen Daniel working at a gas station in Illinois. Completely false. Another woman insisted Daniel was being held in a church basement. Also false. Once a caller claimed Daniel had been forced into a brown panel van right on Branch Street, but when describing the van he changed the description 3 times in a single minute. Every tip was checked, and every time the result was the same: nothing. The team called this period the era of ghosts, leads that appeared just often enough to spark hope, but never touched reality. Yet among all that meaningless noise, the scrap of paper that read "Ask the electrician" stayed in the file, never forgotten. Even years later, Officer Kane admitted he had originally seen it as a sick joke, but time would prove that some seemingly useless clues simply wait patiently for their moment, waiting until enough pieces of the puzzle exist for them to suddenly become clear. Between 1982 and 1985, police made no further breakthroughs, no new physical evidence, no new witnesses, no identification of the stranger who had watched Daniel, no confirmation of the man or woman seen walking with him that night. Every avenue ended in a dead end, and at the center of all that deadlock remained the image of the car abandoned on Branch Street, silent, lifeless, yet the only solid piece of a story no one understood. The anonymous tips came and went like signals from an invisible sender, but they did not yet know that among those signals was one tiny trace that would one day become the turning point of the entire case. Starting with two scrawled words, "Ask the electrician." When Daniel Whitford's disappearance entered its fifth year with no lead strong enough to reopen the investigation, the file gradually became one of the most frustrating cold cases in North St. Louis. Then in early 1986, another incident occurred, sudden, repetitive, and chilling enough to make even the most seasoned detectives re-examine Daniel's case from the beginning. A 19-year-old named Keith Donner, who lived only about 8 blocks from the Whitford home, was reported missing under almost identical circumstances. Keith left his house in the evening to walk to meet friends, but never arrived. The family said he often passed near Branch Street, and that was exactly where police found Keith's car, parked crooked at the curb, doors unlocked, radio on, driver's seat pushed back farther than normal. Everything was eerily the same. Officer Marrow, now assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit, looked at Keith's new file and immediately called Officer Kane, who by this time knew every detail of Daniel's case by heart. They met at the scene at dawn, standing in front of Keith's old Ford, with the dome light still glowing exactly like Daniel's Chevrolet 5 years earlier. Kane only needed one look to say, "It's happening again." The similarities went beyond the car. The last friend Keith spoke to revealed that Keith had felt someone was following him in recent days, just as Daniel had told a coworker before he vanished. Keith had no history of running away or serious conflict. No one saw him forced into a vehicle or in distress. But in a short span of time he disappeared into the dark, leaving behind a car that appeared to bear the fingerprints of someone else's staging. Police began considering the possibility the two disappearances were connected. Still, with no bodies, no direct evidence, and no clear suspect, they could only note similar pattern, a concept the legal system at the time did not take seriously, but enough to make detectives pay attention. As they worked backward through lists of people who lived near both victims, one name began appearing in both geographic circles: Leonard Pierce, a middle-aged electrician, when 1981 had lived 3 blocks from the Whitford house, and later moved to an apartment only 1 street away from where Keith lived. The moment he saw the name, Officer Marrow instantly remembered the mysterious 1984 note, "Ask the electrician." But what made them pause was this. Nothing directly tied Pierce to either disappearance. He had never been arrested, had no criminal record, and had never been reported for suspicious behavior. Moreover, neighbors described him as quiet, keeps to himself, but never causes trouble. Yet as they dug deeper into Pierce between 1986 and 1987, a few details made Kane uneasy. Pierce regularly worked night jobs rewiring warehouses and old businesses around the Branch Street area. He drove an older model panel van and habitually parked in out-of-the-way places. More importantly, in 1981, he had lived only a few hundred yards from the alley where Daniel was last seen. By the time Keith vanished, Pierce had moved to a location exactly 1 block from where Keith usually jogged. Taken together, it still wasn't enough to charge anyone, but it was enough to create a new entry in the investigative file: subject of interest, no evidentiary link. Throughout the late 1980s, police tried to gather everything they could on Pierce. They interviewed neighbors, checked work logs, cross-referenced every electrical job he took, but nothing placed him at either scene at the time of the disappearances. No witness ever saw him speaking to either young man. No physical evidence, and in an era before usable DNA, everything hinged on statements or a suspect's own mistake. Pierce, according to coworkers, was excessively private but not violent. He didn't like anyone coming inside his home, even friends. When questioned, he cooperated, gave short, straightforward answers, never tripped himself up. They couldn't arrest him for feeling off. In 1990, when Keith Donner's case also officially went cold, some younger detectives asked, could it be the same guy? They were shut down immediately for lack of evidence. A chilling coincidence was still just a coincidence in the eyes of the law. By 1995, the files on Daniel Whitford and Keith Donner were transferred to the cold case unit, and ironically, the same year Leonard Pierce moved out of the St. Louis area, leaving behind a string of addresses police had no legal reason to follow. For nearly a decade, the parallels between the two disappearances, nighttime, abandoned vehicle, doors unlocked, radio playing, seat adjusted wrong, no struggle, no consistent witnesses, remained a faint copy of each other. And Leonard Pierce, the electrician who had lived near both victims, remained only a name on the sidelines, tagged insufficient evidence in every report. But though no one said it out loud, every detective carried the same thought: if two disappearances were this similar, the person responsible very likely had not stopped at two. And if that scrap of paper reading "Ask the Electrician" really was the key, then for almost 15 years they had stood inches from the truth, without ever realizing it. For nearly 10 years after both Daniel Whitford's and Keith Donner's disappearances went cold, their files sat quietly in the cold case drawer, never fully closed, but with no new light to reopen them. Then, in 2005, an apparently unrelated event suddenly shattered that silence. An old house on Maple Avenue was demolished, and from its rubble emerged two pieces of evidence, two pieces that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. The house at 118 Maple Avenue was a three-story brick, built in the 1920s, rented by various families over the decades, but badly deteriorated, and condemned by the city. The demolition crew arrived on the morning of June 14, 2005. When the rear ground floor wall was smashed with a jackhammer, a worker heard something fall from inside the cavity. At first he thought it was just plaster or old wiring, but when he bent down, he saw a thick gray-blue piece of fabric, still bearing a small logo. Under the fine dust he realized it wasn't scrap cloth, it was a jacket. Folded inside it was a long-stopped Timex watch. A chill made him stop work immediately and call the site foreman. An hour later police were on scene. Under flashlight beams the dust fell away to reveal faded but legible lettering. UMSL, the abbreviation for University of Missouri, St. Louis. Only one missing person in St. Louis records had ever left home wearing a UMSL jacket. Daniel Whitford. Officer Kane, now close to retirement, was called to the scene. When he picked up the jacket, a cold shiver ran up his arm. More than 20 years had passed since Daniel vanished, a case that seemed swallowed by time. Yet here was the boy's jacket appearing inside the wall of a house that was nowhere near any route Daniel ever took. That alone made it deeply suspicious. Daniel had no reason to be on Maple Avenue. The family even confirmed he had never mentioned the area. But what was stranger still was how the jacket and watch had been concealed. They were found between two layers of wall, the original outer brick, and a thick layer of plaster that had been reapplied, so solidly, it took a rotary hammer to break through. The initial forensic assessment was clear. Hiding the items was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was deliberate, skilled work, and required technical know-how. One detective whispered, "This is the kind of job someone who knows walls would do, or an electrician." And those words instantly brought Officer Merrow back to the 1984 note, "Ask the Electrician." Back then it had been dismissed as a cruel prank. Now it felt like a warning they had ignored. Kane leaned close to the exposed wall. The plaster layer was unusually thick and uneven, not like normal construction, but like someone had patched a previously hollowed-out section in a hurry. The demolition crew's mason commented that this section looked redone by someone who wasn't a professional builder, but was used to quickly sealing walls or running conduit. Who fit that description? A handyman, an off-hours electrician, someone who knew how to open and close a wall without drawing attention. Police immediately pulled the old ownership records for the house. From 1978 to 1984, it had sat vacant, then was rented again in 1985, but a long gap between 1981 and 1983 remained unaccounted for, no record of who had access. Some city utility techs had gone in to do electrical repairs in the early 80s, but the paperwork from that era was riddled with gaps. When Officer Merrow filtered the list of electricians who had lived within a 1-mile radius of Maple Avenue between 1980 and 1986, the name Leonard Pierce surfaced, for the third time in close proximity to the victims. More than that, Pierce had done electrical work in 1982 at a warehouse only 2 blocks from Maple Avenue. An old co-worker described him as someone who habitually hid tools in wall cavities when he needed to. The evidence in the house was no longer theoretical. It was the first physical trace of Daniel since the night he vanished, and it was inside a wall, a place people don't use by accident. When they brought the jacket and watch to the family for confirmation, Daniel's mother needed only one touch at the collar before she broke down crying. Yes, this is the jacket he wore that night. The Timex had stopped at 9:27 p.m., the second hand frozen between 2 ticks. There was no way to know when the battery actually died, but the stillness felt like a message no one could decipher. Still, the item said only one thing clearly: Daniel had been with someone who had access to that wall. But why was his jacket hidden so carefully? And more importantly, who did it? Officers Kane and Marrow returned to the station, feeling both excited and uneasy. Excited because, for the first time in decades, the case had real physical evidence. Uneasy because that evidence only opened new mysteries instead of answering any old ones. If this was the work of someone who knew how to manipulate walls, someone, say, an electrician used to late-night repairs in old neighborhoods, then the name Pierce, for years filed only under possible interest, suddenly carried far more weight than ever before. And from that moment, the Daniel Whitford case, once thought buried by time, began to be peeled open, layer by layer, exactly like the wall where his jacket had been found. The discovery of the UMSL jacket and Timex watch hidden inside the Maple Avenue house wall officially reopened Daniel Whitford's disappearance after more than 20 years. But as the cold case team began re-examining every old piece of evidence, an uncomfortable truth emerged. One that showed they were trying to solve the puzzle with pieces time had warped, or simply taken away. In the very first days of the re-evaluation, cold case detective Lauren Iverson was assigned to catalog every item collected in 1981. She started with the basic scene photos, Daniel's expected route map, the initial report on the abandoned Chevrolet on Branch Street, but when Lauren opened the biological evidence storage locker, she stopped cold. The item Officer Marrow had once documented so clearly, a long dark hair recovered from the back seat of Daniel's car, was gone. No paper evidence bag. No sealed envelope, not even a matching evidence tag number. Lauren moved on to the 1981, 1985 overflow shelves where older items were often consolidated to save space. She checked every tray, every box, every yellowed paper sack, still nothing. That single hair, one of the only physical items ever collected from the car, had vanished. She went back to the 1981 report, hoping to find the original storage location. The report contained only one short line: one long dark hair recovered from rear seat, not consistent with subject's hair. No exact length, no precise color, no description of texture or structure, no note of possible donor gender, no final storage location. In the modern era, a single hair like that would be enough for DNA profiling, database comparison, or suspect matching. But in 1981, forensics relied on microscopic morphology, color, curl pattern, cuticle structure, and the only surviving description was a vague note: dark medium thickness. Lauren sat at the table staring at the file, a mix of anger and helplessness washing over her. This was the chronic headache of cold case units across the country. Evidence from the 1970s and 80s had not been preserved to modern standards. Warehouse moves, mergers, floods, fires, or simple mismanagement had caused countless priceless items to disappear. And in Daniel's case, that hair wasn't just priceless, it might have been the only direct link between the two disappearances. Cold Case Unit Supervisor Andrew Solberg received Lauren's report. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, then said, "We can't get it back, but let's see how it was ever described." They tracked down the retired forensic tech who had written the original note in 1981. Her memory was faint. "I just remember it wasn't Daniel's hair, but it wasn't distinctive enough to determine gender. Back then we had no way to do more." Her words left the room silent, not because she was wrong, but because the limitations of that era had now become the biggest obstacle in the new investigation. And the problems didn't end there. When they reviewed the full 2005 report on the UMSL jacket, they discovered something else. No record existed of anyone comparing wall debris or fibers to the 1981 case. Because the case hadn't been officially reopened yet, the demolition crew simply turned over the jacket and watch. They never documented the wall cavity before it was destroyed. Any biological trace that might have been in the wall, sweat, skin cells, stray fibers, was lost the moment the wall collapsed. When Solberg reviewed the files from 1986, 1995, he realized that if they had even minimal DNA from Daniel's jacket, they could have compared it to everyone who ever lived or worked around Maple Avenue, including electrician Leonard Pierce. But in 1981, no one knew DNA would become revolutionary. No one preserved the jacket as a biological sample, they kept it only as personal property. The entire 1981 forensic effort was like looking at the world through a foggy lens. They could see the general shape but never the fine details. That made an already stalled case even more fragile. If the hair still existed, they could identify who had been in Daniel's car that night. If wall debris had been preserved, they could know who hid the jacket and watch. If electricians who worked on Maple Avenue had been DNA screened, they could narrow the suspect pool. Instead, they had only faded handwriting on paper, scattered notes, and evidence missing its most critical piece: context. Lauren closed the evidence box, her hand still trembling slightly. If we had that hair, this case would probably look completely different. Solberg looked at her, his eyes heavy but resolute. That's what cold cases are. We can't go back to 1981, but we can move forward from 2005. He picked up the photo of the dust-covered UMSL jacket and stared at the collar stitching where Daniel's fingers had once touched it the night he left home. Because no matter how much evidence had vanished, no matter how painfully inadequate 1981 forensics had been, one truth remained sharp as a needle through 3 decades. The jacket didn't crawl into the wall by itself. Someone put it there, and that someone was still living beneath layers of secrets the case had not yet reached. Evidence may be lost, but the questions remain. And by 2019, as forensic technology entered a new era, the Daniel Whitford case was about to take another step forward, even though no one in the cold case unit yet realized they were closing in on a name they had overlooked for years. As the 2020s began, the St. Louis Police Department started restructuring its backlog of decades-old cases. A wave of disappearances from the 1970s through the 1990s was transferred to a newly formed cold case task force, equipped with digitized imaging analysis, timeline reconstruction software, and far more advanced geographic profiling tools than had ever existed before. Among the cases prioritized for fresh review, the files on Daniel Whitford and the strikingly similar disappearance of Keith Donner were flagged high risk because of their unsolved parallel, still unexplained nature. The moment the old boxes were opened, what caught the task force's attention was not the jacket or the Timex found in 2005, it was the folded paper roadmap recovered from Daniel's car the night he vanished. From 1981 until 2019, that map had always been treated as an insignificant personal item, because family and friends insisted Daniel never used maps. He knew his part of St. Louis too well for that, but at the time no one had asked the obvious follow-up: if Daniel didn't use maps, then whose map was it? The task force decided to digitize every related document, including the map. Analyst Jenna Rourke scanned it at ultra-high resolution and ran enhancement software on the creases and faded ink. She discovered something no one in 40 years had had the tools to see: 2 very faint red circles, almost erased by moisture and time but recoverable with digital filters. What made Jenna catch her breath was not the circles themselves, but their locations. When overlaid on a modern St. Louis map, the 2 circles corresponded to 2 long-demolished houses that had stood in the 1970s. The task force pulled the city's old property records. It took days to cross-reference the yellowed ledgers, but when the results appeared on screen, the room went quiet. Both circled properties had once belonged to Leonard Pierce, one on Ridgely Avenue, one on North Sullivan Street. Both well outside any area Daniel had reason to visit, and both within the radius Pierce, lived and worked between 1977 and 1983. The discovery was described in the internal report as the first geographical link between Pierce and the victim's last known trajectory. Even more telling, the map had been refolded precisely along creases that pointed toward those two addresses. In other words, the map wasn't just accidentally in the car, it had been used to mark something. So who marked it? Why mark Pierce's former houses? And why was that map inside Daniel Whitford's Chevrolet? Question led to question, and every answer pointed to a name investigators had never been able to tie to hard evidence in over 40 years. Pierce. The task force began retracing every footprint Pierce had ever left. The geographic team rebuilt his residences, workplaces, and every electrical contract he took in the 1970s and 80s. Each location was plotted on a digital map. Slowly a strange pattern emerged. The majority of places Pierce had lived or worked fell within the daily travel radius of both Daniel Whitford and Keith Donner. It was not proof of a crime, but it was a geographic signal impossible to ignore. While the map analysis team dug deeper, the task force document unit kept re-examining every piece of physical evidence and every anonymous call from the 1980s. By this point, the scrap of paper that read "Ask the Electrician" was no longer brushed aside. It was pinned to the linkage board as a key indicator, and for the first time the team formally hypothesized the person who sent the anonymous note in 1984 may have known about Pierce, but known in what sense? Accusing, warning, or covering something up. A senior detective who had worked the initial Keith Donner case in 1986 recalled one detail that had never been fully explored. Pierce's electrical repair logs from that period noted that he had replastered walls himself at several sites to conceal wiring. That matched chillingly with the way Daniel's jacket had been hidden inside the Maple Avenue wall. Though it still couldn't be proven he was the one who placed the jacket there, the house had had multiple tenants over the years. The act of replastering was typical of electricians. And this coincidence, combined with the map marking two of Pierce's former houses, meant Pierce was no longer just a name on the edge of the file. He was now officially classified primary person of interest. When the task force rebuilt Pierce's residential history, they noticed something chilling. Pierce had moved several times during the period Daniel disappeared, and each move stayed close to the area where the victims were last seen. Within weeks, the task force drew up plans to widen the investigation, track down old friends, former landlords, co-workers, and re-examine every electrical contract Pierce ever had. But the map discovery remained the pivotal point. Using 2022 technology, they ran faint ink reconstruction software and determined how the marker's hand had moved. The result: the red circles had not been drawn inside the car. They had been marked earlier. That ruled out the theory that Daniel picked the map up somewhere. The map had been placed in the car. The only question left, and still unanswerable at that stage, was who placed it there, and why would someone need to mark two of Pierce's old houses, a clue no one noticed for nearly 40 years. When the task force closed that day's briefing, a heavy silence filled the room. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. For the first time since 1981, the Daniel Whitford case was no longer a string of disconnected dead ends. It was taking shape. It had direction. And that direction, even if not yet provable, was spiraling tighter and tighter toward a man who had once been suspected and then dismissed. Leonard Pierce. Once the task force zeroed in on Leonard Pierce as the primary person of interest, they knew every theory, every geographic coincidence, every circumstantial clue was still too weak to push the case much further. They needed real, undeniable evidence, an anchor that could not be argued away. And that chance arrived in 2022, when the forensics lab proposed a brand new procedure, extracting touch DNA from the UMSL jacket recovered in the wall in 2005. Touch DNA technology, pulling profiles from skin cells left on fabric, wood or metal, did not exist in 1981 and was still immature in the early 2000s. But by 2022, the sensitivity had crossed the threshold needed for decades-old items. The UMSL jacket was processed in a state-of-the-art lab under multiple air filtration layers. Forensic technician Nadia Coleman used specialized adhesive tape and micro-sampling tools to collect whatever cells remained on the collar, cuffs and torso, the areas most likely to hold sweat or heavy contact. At first, she kept expectations low. The jacket had been sealed in a wall for years, exposed to temperature swings, moisture, bacteria, and mechanical disturbance during demolition. But when the samples went into the analyzer, a faint profile began to emerge. Not complete enough to determine gender instantly, but enough to show two distinct DNA sources. One matching a male of European descent, almost certainly Daniel, the second belonging to another individual. Not random contamination. The task force waited. A week later the profile sharpened. The moment it was run through the comparison database, Nadia frowned. The system returned. No match found. Strange. A profile that clear should have produced at least a partial hit. She tried the state database. Still nothing. Then she took the final option, manual comparison against DNA from everyone inside the current investigative circle, including Leonard Pierce. Pierce's sample had been collected in 1998 during an unrelated administrative matter, not a criminal case. Nadia entered Pierce's old file code by hand. This time the machine did not say no match. It said inconclusive, data format error, that was not normal. A format error meant Pierce's DNA had been entered into the system years earlier, but in an outdated coding style that the post-2001 standardized format could no longer read accurately. Worse, the profile had never been converted during system upgrades. It had simply sat there, corrupted, meaning every prior DNA scan, whether from Daniel's jacket or any other evidence, could never have matched Pierce. The task force fell silent as the truth sank in. One technical mistake, one data entry error in 1998, had cost them almost 25 years of not seeing a connection that should have been obvious long ago. That realization pushed Nadia to do what no one had thought to do before: rebuild Pierce's DNA profile from the original 1998 biological sample, instead of trusting the broken database entry. Once the fresh, correctly formatted profile was uploaded, she reran the comparison. This time it took 3 seconds. The screen lit up with the words everyone had been holding their breath for: match found, 98.7% probability. Contact DNA from garment. The touch DNA on Daniel's jacket belonged to Leonard Pierce. The room froze for several seconds. Solberg was the first to break the silence. "We've got him." Kane, who had chased the case for half his life, simply closed his eyes. Something in his shoulders sagged, not sadness, but the feeling of finally seeing light after decades in the dark. The task force immediately expanded the analysis. Pierce's DNA was not in random contact areas like the cuffs. It was concentrated on the collar, the place someone grabs or pulls when moving or controlling another person. The remaining DNA, almost certainly Daniel's, appeared inside the collar and across the chest. This indicated someone whose DNA matched Pierce had directly grasped, pulled, or handled Daniel's jacket. Not by accidental touch, not by later contamination, but by deliberate, forceful physical contact. The official forensic report stated, evidence consistent with physical handling or removal of garment from victim by second individual. The task force instantly cross-referenced the wall plastering technique at Maple Avenue with methods electricians used to seal conduit runs. The findings were damning: uneven plaster thickness, horizontal trowel marks consistent with a small finishing blade, hammer dents matching the type of electric hammer Pierce was known to carry in that era. Not enough for a conviction, but more than enough for a formal interview. Pierce was brought to the station as a material witness. When asked why his DNA was on the jacket of a young man missing for 40 years, Pierce showed no panic, but everyone in the room felt the wariness in his eyes. He said, "I never met the kid. I don't know anything about that jacket, but forensics do not lie." And 2022 science is not as easily fooled as 1981 science. When the task force re-examined the entire file under the new light of the DNA match, they realized something even more chilling. Had Pierce's DNA profile not been entered incorrectly in 1998, Daniel's case might have been solved 25 years earlier. In the report submitted to command, the task force wrote a line that had never appeared in this case before. Pierce is no longer a peripheral figure, he is the central suspect. And from the moment the touch DNA confirmed the match, the portrait of a man once dismissed as too ordinary to suspect finally came into sharp, undeniable focus, sharp enough that no one could deny they had missed him for far too long. The case entered a new chapter, no longer speculation, no longer coincidence, no longer shadows. For the first time in over 4 decades, Daniel Whitford had someone the police could finally name. When the touch DNA matched Leonard Pierce, the task force finally held the first piece of evidence strong enough to shake the foundation of the entire case. But science was only half the picture. The other half, proving Pierce was near Daniel the night he vanished, required dismantling something that had stood for over 4 decades: Pierce's 1981 alibi. That alibi had been the main reason the original detectives cleared him. In 1981, Pierce claimed that at the exact time Daniel disappeared, he was doing electrical work at a small house in the Hyde Park neighborhood, almost 4 miles from the Branch Street scene. The homeowner at the time, a man named Walter Griggs, confirmed it. In the old report, Griggs's statement was marked consistent and credible. No one questioned it further. No one dug deeper. Pierce slipped off the suspect list, and for 40 years that alibi stood like an unbreakable wall. But after the DNA result, the task force decided to do what no one in 1981 had thought to do: find Walter Griggs again. Griggs, now 74, lived in a small town south of Missouri. He was surprised when the task force knocked on his door but agreed to talk. When asked about the night Pierce worked on his house, he gave a thin smile. "Good Lord, that was so long ago. How could I remember?" Solberg, who had investigated hundreds of cases in his career, recognized the evasion immediately. There was none of the confidence that comes with recounting an honest memory, only vagueness masked by a polite smile. When the team showed him the 1981 statement transcript, Griggs stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then, voice trembling, I'm not sure that was the actual night." A long silence followed. Kane, the man who had once believed this alibi was solid, felt his heart skip a beat. Gently but firmly, Jenna asked, "Mr. Griggs, do you remember how many times Pierce came to your house?" After a pause, he admitted Pierce had come 3 times, not once, and worse, he could no longer recall which night was which. That alone was enough to crack the alibi. But the task force pressed on. When asked whether Pierce ever arrived late, or suddenly left a job midway, Griggs went quiet for a long time before saying, "Sometimes disappeared for a while. I didn't pay attention." That was the first moment Griggs looked at the floor, avoiding the detective's eyes. In the second interview, Solberg changed tactics. "Mr. Griggs, in 1981, did you feel pressured by anyone when you gave your statement?" At first he denied it, but when Jenna showed him the travel time analysis, proving Pierce could easily have left Hyde Park, gone to Baden, and returned within the window Daniel vanished, Griggs's hands began to shake. Finally, he whispered, "He didn't threaten me directly, but he said if I got it wrong, I could cost him his job, and maybe cause trouble for my family." That sentence froze the entire room. Kane sat motionless, fingers laced together. 40-plus years earlier, he had believed this alibi. He had seen Pierce as an ordinary man wrongly suspected, and now he had to face the fact he had been deceived. Griggs continued, "He came to my house before the police even asked. Told me I should say he was there the night before. I didn't think much of it then. He seemed polite, decent. How was I supposed to know?" A statement that ended in belated regret. But the most devastating blow came when the task force located Pierce's old work calendar, a technician's notebook kept in the tax files of a power company that had once hired him freelance. On the page for October 1981, in Pierce's own handwriting under the neon light, "Hyde Park reschedule." Reschedule. That appointment did not happen the night Daniel disappeared. Griggs might not remember exactly, but Pierce's notebook did not lie. He was not at Hyde Park that night. He had no alibi. In the internal report the task force wrote, "The alibi collapses under re-examination. Witness confirms coercion. Calendar disproves the timeline." The statement went on to note, The 1981 statement was influenced by pressure from Pierce. Travel time analysis shows Pierce could easily have reached Baden. Pierce's own work log negates the alibi. These facts were sufficient to completely dismantle the argument that had kept him clear of suspicion for 4 decades. As they left Griggy's house, Jenna said something that sent a chill through the entire team. He didn't just lie. He manufactured an alibi, which meant Pierce knew he would need an alibi. He knew the timing of Daniel's disappearance might lead police to him. He manipulated a witness before he was even questioned. That is not the behavior of an innocent man. That is the behavior of someone who knew exactly what happened that night and knew what he had to do to hide it. When Solberg convened the task force that weekend, no one referred to Pierce as a possible suspect anymore. He had become the official suspect, a man standing at the center of 2 disappearances, present on the map, inside the wall, in the DNA, and now in the collapse of the very alibi that had once saved him. Solberg ended the meeting with a sentence that left the room in dead silence. If he dared to stage an alibi in 1981, then we can be certain of one thing: Daniel never left Branch Street alone. From that moment, investigating Pierce was no longer about gathering information. It became a race to tear down a lie that had lasted more than 40 years. Once Pierce's alibi was officially dismantled, the task force understood they stood before a once-in-decades chance to reconstruct Daniel's final movements. But they needed one more thing: irrefutable physical proof, placing Pierce at a specific location the moment Daniel vanished. And paradoxically, it did not come from modern DNA technology. It came from something smaller, older, almost forgotten since 1981, the soil stuck under the tires of Daniel's car. In the original case, forensic techs had collected samples of the fine reddish-brown dust caked in the Chevrolet's wheel wells. In 1981, they simply noted that this soil did not match the Baden area or Branch Street and filed the sample away. Back then, no one thought soil could solve a case. They kept it only as procedure, with no real purpose. But in 2022, as the task force combed through every old item, every scrap, every fiber, every speck of dust, they saw a possibility no one in the past had had the time or tools to pursue: matching the soil to St. Louis' geologic maps. Geological analyst Professor Lauren Bowditch from the University of Missouri was brought in. She asked to see the sample immediately. Under the microscope, the fine reddish-brown dirt revealed traces of elite clay and tiny iron oxide rock fragments, a fairly distinctive mix. After just 3 days of testing, Bowditch presented findings that left everyone speechless. This soil does not occur in Baden, nor around Branch Street, but it matches the ground at an old property on South Madison Street, one of the few places in St. Louis with this exact signature. Solberg pulled up the historical map instantly, and exactly as Bowditch feared, the location matched a house where Leonard Pierce had done off-the-books electrical work in the early 80s, a job never permitted, never officially recorded, mentioned only vaguely in Pierce's personal notebook. The briefing room went completely still. The soil under Daniel's tires was not random. If Daniel never drove to South Madison Street, and every piece of evidence showed he never left the Baden area that night, then who took the car there and later dumped it on Branch Street? The answer became clear and terrifying. The car had been driven by someone else to South Madison Street before being abandoned on Branch Street, and the person with reason, access, and knowledge to visit that derelict house was the very man who had illegally rewired it. Leonard Pierce. South Madison Street today is only an empty lot. The house was torn down in 1998 after repeated safety complaints. Still, the task force searched the site. It wasn't easy. The ground had changed over time. But beneath the overgrown grass, Bowditch located traces of the old foundation. When the team hand-dug layer by layer, using forensic archaeology methods, they uncovered remnants of brick footings and concrete floor, enough to confirm they were standing in the right place. In the rear corner, where a small windowless room once stood, investigators found strange signs: the concrete floor, patched with mortar of a different composition from the rest. The newer concrete, by geological age estimate, dated roughly to 1980, 1983. Horizontal trowel marks identical to the plastering technique at Maple Avenue. Bowditch said quietly, This isn't builder work. This is the style of someone used to patching walls to hide wiring. Every eye turned to Solberg. No one needed to say it, but everyone understood what had just been uncovered. This could be the room where Daniel was taken after he disappeared. When the soil sample from Daniel's car was reanalyzed, Bowditch pointed out that the dirt in the wheel wells wasn't just foundation soil, it also contained traces of iron-rich rust typical of repair yards or places with exposed old metal. If the South Madison Street house had open wiring, rusted posts, or leftover equipment from previous tenants, it fit perfectly. More importantly, this soil could not have come from Branch Street. Branch Street soil is mostly pale gravel and industrial dust, which means the car went to South Madison Street before being taken to Branch Street. Whoever drove it either intercepted Daniel, or took the car from near the Whitford home, drove to the house Pierce had worked on, then moved the car to Branch Street, and staged the abandonment to mislead investigators. Every single piece now pointed in the same direction. Solberg stared at the map, where every Pierce linked point, old homes, workplaces, off-the-books electrical jobs, connected into a web, and at the center of that web were Daniel and Keith. When they re-examined the timeline of Daniel's disappearance, one question rose above the rest. If Pierce knew the South Madison house was abandoned, rarely visited, and had a windowless room, could he have used it to hold Daniel? No one on the task force dared answer directly, but everyone thought the same thing, and that was what drove them to keep digging the site more thoroughly. At the edge of the patched concrete slab, the team found a small scrap of dark blue fabric, a short length of rotted cord, and metal fragments that had once been part of a padlock. None of it was enough to confirm Daniel's presence, but none of it ruled him out either. Back at the station, Solberg wrote the strongest conclusion line the case had seen in years. Geological evidence suggests vehicle was brought to a known Pierce-related site. High probability of victim presence. The reddish soil, once dismissed as meaningless dust, had become the first thing to lead the task force to a real tangible stand-inside-it location. No longer guesswork, no longer vague silhouettes, no longer coerced statements. This was geographic, scientific evidence, independent of anyone's memory, undistorted by time, and it said the one thing everyone knew but had never dared put in writing. Daniel had been there, or at the very least, his car had been driven there by the person who took Daniel to that house. And the only individual with motive, skill, and opportunity to use that place was Leonard Pierce. From this point, the investigation shifted from collecting clues to a single clear goal, proving Pierce was at South Madison Street the night Daniel vanished. And the next piece of evidence they were about to uncover would turn the entire file a completely different color. As the investigation into Leonard Pierce heated up day by day with geographic evidence, DNA, and the total collapse of his alibi, the task force believed they were close to having enough for formal interrogation. But in early 2024, another unexpected event, from a source no one saw coming, pushed the case into an entirely new turning point. It came from an elderly man, living almost 3 hours from St. Louis, and from a document lost for over 40 years. In March 2024, the task force received a call from the duty sergeant, saying an older man insisted, "I have information about the young man Daniel who went missing in 1981. What made Jenna sit up straight was his next sentence. "I reported this back then, but no one ever called me back." His name was Raymond Ulrich, 71, a retired long-haul truck driver, and when the team met him, Ray was anything but vague or confused. On the contrary, he remembered every detail with startling clarity. Ray said that on the night Daniel disappeared, he was driving through Baden to make an early delivery the next morning. As his truck passed near the intersection of Baden Avenue and Branch Street, he saw two people standing beside a car parked at the curb. One of them, he said, was Daniel Whitford. "I knew it was him, because I'd seen him around the warehouse where I dropped loads," Ray explained. "The other man I also recognized, Leonard Pierce. He used to do electrical work at several warehouses nearby." A terrified silence fell over the room. Solberg leaned forward. "You're saying you reported this in 1981? Ray nodded. "I called the police the very next day when I heard the kid was missing. I told them exactly whose truck I saw him get into. They said someone would get back to me." "And then?" Jenna asked. "No one ever did. There was still an old bitterness in his voice, not because he had been ignored, but because he had seen something important, and it had vanished into the silence of the system. The task force could not rely solely on a 40-year-old witness memory without corroboration. But what caught their attention was that Ray described Pierce's 1981 truck perfectly, a light brown Ford pickup with an old steel bed, dented on the right side. That detail matched Pierce's registered vehicle at the time, information never publicly released. Ray could not have known that detail unless he had truly seen it. Ray's statement raised a question no one wanted to believe. Had police really lost a critical report? Jenna and Lauren began combing through the 1981 master files. Most reports were sequentially numbered, but one batch from October carried the label MISC, used for calls that weren't clearly categorized. Hundreds of sheets in that pile, mostly illegal parking, noise complaints after 10 p.m., or crank calls. Then Lauren stopped. She lifted a yellowed sheet into the light, her heart pounding as she read the faded handwriting. Caller reports seeing young male enter pickup truck audio/older male on bad A. No caller name, no name of the young man, no name of the older man, no license plate, no follow-up form, just a scribbled note, filed under 8110 Whitman, an unrelated bar fight that happened the same day. Ray's report had been filed under the wrong case, and therefore never reached Daniel's investigative team. Solberg placed both hands on the table and said nothing for nearly 30 seconds, not because he was shocked, but because he felt the full weight of that mistake. One tiny error, one misfiled paper report, had kept police from ever knowing a witness saw Daniel get into Pierce's truck, from ever digging deeper, from ever connecting the two names in the very first days. Instead, they had let Pierce build his alibi undisturbed. When Ray's statement was laid on the table, alongside the tire well soil, and the touch DNA match to Pierce, a picture emerged clearer than ever before. Ray saw Daniel standing with Pierce. Daniel got into Pierce's truck. Daniel's car carried soil from South Madison Street, where Pierce had done illegal wiring. Daniel's car was abandoned on Branch Street, a spot Pierce knew well from numerous nearby jobs. No longer coincidence, no longer theory, no longer speculation. Ray was not just an additional witness, he was the final piece of the 1981 timeline, confirming Daniel left the neighborhood in Pierce's vehicle. The task force still had to test Ray's reliability. They asked him to describe Daniel's clothing: gray-blue jacket 100% match with the UMSL jacket. Pierce's clothing, dark green work coat matched co-worker descriptions from 1980, 1982. Time of observation, around 7 p.m. Matched neighbor statements of Daniel leaving home. Daniel's demeanor, like someone called him over, no sign of struggle. The last detail made Solberg's skin crawl. I saw the kid get in the truck, willingly, like he knew the driver. This suggested Pierce did not forcibly abduct Daniel on the spot. He may have approached him earlier, or Daniel had met him at least once before, which lined up with what co-worker Marcus had said. Daniel told me a stranger had been watching the house several nights in a row. When the misfiled report was presented to command, the cold case captain stood silent for a long moment, and then said, "If this report had landed on the right desk in 1981, the entire case would have gone in a completely different direction." And that was the most painful truth of all. Daniel's investigation had been derailed on day one, because one sheet of paper went into the wrong folder. If Ray had been interviewed in 1981, Pierce's alibi would have been questioned immediately. Daniel's car would have been scrutinized against every property Pierce ever wired. Pierce might have been surveilled or arrested in the 1980s. Keith Donner might never have become a victim. That mistake did not merely derail an investigation, it may have cost other lives. As the interview ended, Ray sat quietly for a moment, and then said a sentence that silenced every detective in the room. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me again for 40 years. With that one line, the task force knew they had just been given the greatest gift time can still offer: a living, healthy, sharp-minded witness, willing to take the stand if needed. The geological evidence had opened the path. The touch DNA had tied Pierce to Daniel's jacket. The alibi had collapsed. And now, a direct eyewitness placing Daniel in Pierce's truck on the exact night he vanished. The case was no longer scattered fragments. They connected seamlessly, completely, and with a sharpness nothing could deny. The task force knew that after this moment, the next goal was crystal clear: bring Pierce into the interrogation room, not as a person of interest, but as the first and only suspect. Once eyewitness Raymond Ulrich confirmed he had seen Daniel get into Leonard Pierce's truck on the night of the disappearance, the task force understood they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. This was no longer just an expanding investigation. This was time to act. Based on the touch DNA, the demolished alibi, the soil leading to a real crime scene, and now a direct eyewitness, a comprehensive search warrant for Pierce's current home, a small house on the edge of Walnut Park East, was signed almost immediately. That morning the St. Louis sky was overcast, gray clouds hanging low, cold wind slipping through the wooden fence around Pierce's backyard. When the task force vehicles pulled up, Solberg took a long breath, as if preparing to step into a room he had been searching for all these years. Pierce showed no surprise when he saw them. He simply opened the door stiffly, eyes wary, shifting slightly sideways to block the entryway, as though that small motion alone could keep them from seeing what was inside. "Mr. Pierce, we have a search warrant." Solberg handed him the paper, without waiting for consent. Pierce stepped back slowly, but never took his eyes off them. Everyone on the team felt something off, an undercurrent of tension, not yet open resistance, but clearly a man fighting to stay in control. Inside the house the light was dimmer than normal, heavy curtains, weak bulbs, furniture pared down to the bare minimum. But what stood out wasn't the lack of belongings, it was the calculation in how everything was arranged: tables and chairs perfectly aligned, not a centimeter off, kitchen spotless, cabinets containing nothing extra, as if Pierce had deliberately erased any trace that might reveal who he really was. But people who have worked cold cases long enough know this: those who hide the hardest often give away the most important things, not in obvious places, but in the spots they believe no one will look. Pierce's basement was low-ceilinged, raw concrete walls with uneven plaster patches, strikingly similar to the technique found at Maple Avenue and South Madison Street. That alone put the task force on high alert. Jenna ran her flashlight along the wall. "See, same hand-troweled ridges as the other two sites." No one argued. When they reached the rear corner, Lauren noticed a thin vertical crack, as if the wall had once been opened and resealed. She crouched, tapped lightly with her fingertips. The sound wasn't the solid thud of original concrete. It echoed back like fresh plaster over a hollow space. "We're opening this," Solberg said flatly. A technician immediately brought in a specialized mortar chisel. A few strikes and chunks of plaster broke away, falling to the floor like white stone dust. Behind the plaster was a neatly cut rectangular cavity, large enough to hide a document box or personal items. And inside was something no one expected to still exist after more than 4 decades. The technician pulled out first a small leather-bound notebook, cover worn, spine slightly cracked. When Jenna opened it, her breath caught. The first pages were lists of names. No last names, just first names and approximate ages. Daniel, 19, 20. Keith, 18, 19. T. Harris, approx 17 MP, 20. Then, the last line was scratched out repeatedly, as if trying to erase it. Next to the names were short notes: shift end time, which route lives with, walks home, usually alone on Mondays. Not an address book, not a work schedule, a stalking log. Multiple young men the same age and profile as Daniel, listed with the same kind of routine details. Even if not direct proof of a crime, there was no innocent explanation for a notebook like this. Solberg said quietly. He was selecting targets. No one disagreed. Right behind the notebook was a thin, brittle manila folder, corners yellowed and dry. When it was opened, the task force saw something no one thought had survived: a single handwritten diary page from Daniel, one page, torn from its original book. Nothing else, just that lone sheet, soft slanted handwriting unmistakably Daniel's. On it he had written short lines, like notes before heading to work. "Saw that guy by the streetlight again. Not sure if it's a coincidence. When I went to Marcus's place, felt like someone was behind me." The page ended abruptly, as if cut off mid-thought. No date, but the ink matched the type of pen Daniel's co-workers said he always used. Jenna whispered, "He took this page from Daniel's diary. That means he was inside Daniel's room," Lauren finished, "or Daniel was somewhere Pierce could get it." Both possibilities led to the same conclusion: Pierce had far closer contact with Daniel than anyone had ever known. The notebook wasn't only names, it also contained scattered entries, like planning notes, back alley quiet, no cameras, bus schedule light, street light out, can approach from rear. The final line stood alone: leave no trace. Solberg stared at the page a long time, then closed the notebook, as if the act helped him swallow the rage rising inside him. While the task force searched the basement, Pierce was detained in the living room, sitting motionless but unable to hide his restlessness. When Solberg came upstairs and told him they had found significant documents, his face changed visibly. No longer calm, no longer cold-eyed, only desperate vigilance remained. "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice trembled slightly, only those standing close could hear it. Kane stepped forward, looked him straight in the eye. "We have a page of Daniel's diary inside your house. Explain that." Pierce dropped his gaze, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles went white. He said nothing, could say nothing. That silence didn't save him, it accused him louder than words. Everything the task force recovered from Pierce's house was officially catalogued as follows: notebook tracking multiple young men, including Daniel and Keith, a torn page from Daniel's diary, proving Pierce had direct or indirect access to the victim's personal belongings, wall plastering technique consistent with the two prior crime scene locations, house diagram with areas marked sealed, matching the hidden rooms previously found at Maple Avenue and South Madison Street, detailed notes appearing to describe a target selection pattern. None of it stood alone, every item dovetailed with the DNA, the 2024 eyewitness, the tire well soil, the collapsed alibi, and the map marking two Pierce-owned houses. For the first time in 4 decades, the Daniel Whitford case was no longer a web of speculation. It had become a logical structure with Pierce at its exact center. As the last evidence bag was sealed, Solberg said a sentence the task force knew was absolutely true. He didn't just know Daniel, he stalked him, longer than any of us imagined. That night, the entire team left Pierce's house in silence. No one spoke to anyone else, but everyone felt the same thing. They had just walked into the lair of a predator, and for the first time, they knew exactly who his prey had been. The search of Pierce's house ended just before 6 p.m., but no one on the task force went home that day. They all gathered in the St. Louis Police Department's secure briefing room, the newly seized evidence bags spread across the table, the notebook tracking young men, Daniel's torn diary page, and the chilling notes about habits, shift end times, approach points. That was when they knew there could be no more delay. Pierce had to be arrested. At 7:42 p.m., the arrest warrant for Leonard Pierce was signed, based on the combined weight of touch DNA, eyewitness Raymond Ulrich, the collapsed alibi, soil matching the crime scene, and the stalking notebook found in his home. When police returned to Pierce's house with the warrant, he was standing on the porch, as if he had known that moment was coming. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he didn't openly resist, but the fake calm was gone from his face, replaced by a calculating look, as though he were choosing which story to tell. Kane read the charge clearly: "You are under arrest in connection with the disappearances of Daniel Whitford and Keith Donner." Pierce narrowed his eyes, tilted his head slightly, and let out a very soft breath, as if he had rehearsed this script long ago. "I didn't do anything, but I know who did." The sentence made every detective's expression harden. In the interrogation room, Pierce showed none of the panic common in suspects facing overwhelming evidence. Instead, he sat straight-backed, hands lightly clasped on the table, and began telling the story he believed would save him. He claimed an old co-worker named Ron Carney, an electrician from the same era, was the one who had stalked the young men in Baden, not him. Ron was the one with problems. He followed kids, said creepy things. "I stayed away from him." Solberg asked, Then why are Daniel's and Keith's names in the notebook hidden in your house? I kept it because Ron gave it to me. He asked me to hold it. I didn't know what it was. The story sounded rehearsed, but there was one detail Pierce hadn't counted on. Ronald Carney had been dead since 1995, and he continued. The jacket in the wall, that was Ron too. He hid it at Maple Avenue, not me. Solberg glanced at Jenna. One small nod, and the entire task force knew Pierce had just backed himself into a corner. Forensics destroyed Pierce's story with two simple facts: timing of the cell jacket concealment. Forensic analysis dated the Maple Avenue wall plaster via silicone polymer content, not common before the 1990s, to between 1999 and 2003, meaning the jacket was hidden at least 4 years after Ron was already dead. Solberg slid the report across the table. You say Ron hid it, but he died in 1995. This plaster is from 2000. Explain. Pierce pressed his lips together. A deep crease appeared on his forehead. No answer. The victim tracking notebook was written in a single handwriting. Not two. Handwriting experts confirmed the writing in the stalking notebook and on Pierce's old business cards belonged to the same person. No trace of a second handwriting. No sign of Ron's writing. No other person involved. When that report was placed on the table, Pierce glanced at it and turned his face away. As the interrogation continued, it became clear Pierce was no longer trying to prove his innocence. He was trying to create a scapegoat, a dead man who could not defend himself and could never contradict him. By blaming everything on Ron, he understood how damning the forensic evidence was. He had no alibi left to fall back on. He believed pinning it on a dead man would muddy the waters enough to confuse the investigation. But the task force had come too far to be thrown off, and they had one more fact that completely demolished his statement. Ron Carney had never worked at the two key locations, Maple Avenue and South Madison Street. The off-the-books electrical records showed only Pierce appeared at both sites. No one named Ron. Solberg asked the final question, the one that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. If you're not involved, how do you know the cell jacket was hidden at Maple Avenue? Pierce froze. His breathing hitched. His hands clenched under the table. He had just revealed something that had never been in any public report. The Maple Avenue house no longer existed. The exact location where the jacket was found had never been released to the press. Even most veteran cops didn't know. An innocent person could not know the jacket was hidden in that wall, unless they were the one who put it there. That was the final hammer blow. When Solberg ended the interview, Pierce switched tactics, said Ron forced him, said he only held the notebook for Ron, said he didn't remember, said he had been threatened. But every new story he built was shattered by the forensics. The plaster timing didn't match. The tire well soil tied Daniel's car to a site Pierce worked. The touch DNA on the collar showed control force contact. The notebook was in Pierce's handwriting. The torn diary page could only have been taken by someone with close access to the victim. There was no escape. After more than 2 hours, when Pierce was exhausted and sat silent, hands clenched white-knuckled, Solberg stood and delivered the closing line of the session. You didn't just hide the truth, you built a shadow to blame. But science doesn't accept shadows. Pierce did not look up, did not object, did not ask for a lawyer. He simply sat still, in the collapse he had tried to postpone for over 40 years. When the interrogation room door closed, the task force knew they had crossed the decisive point. From this moment on, it was no longer about whether Pierce was involved. It was about proving how deeply he was involved, and how many lives had paid the price. After more than 4 decades of waiting, the Daniel Whitford case finally entered the phase no one dared imagine in the 80s or 90s. A public criminal trial, with Leonard Pierce as the defendant. No more closed interrogation rooms, no more yellowed forgotten files. Now every truth, from the soil sample, the touch DNA, to the victim tracking notebook, stood before a federal jury under the bright lights of the St. Louis City courtroom. Pierce walked in, wearing an old gray suit, looking like an ordinary man. But to those in the gallery, Daniel's family, Keith Donner's family, and Raymond Ulrich, he was no longer a face in the crowd. He was the center of a 43-year nightmare. Pierce's attorney Martin Halstead, a seasoned defense lawyer, didn't try to prove his client innocent by denying everything. That was nearly impossible against the touch DNA and the notebook found in Pierce's house. Instead, he chose a classic but dangerous tactic: throw another shadow into the middle of the story. Halstead stood before the jury and said, "There is another person with motive, someone who was seen around the victims, someone the police overlooked." He named Michael Foster, a mechanic arrested in 1980 for disorderly conduct in Baden, with a record of threatening local teens, and who lived near Branch Street at the same time Daniel vanished. Halstead argued, Foster knew some of the names in the stalking notebook. He drove a similar pickup to the one Pierce claimed someone else used. He once said he didn't like kids walking past his shop at night, and crucially, Foster died in 1991, meaning he couldn't defend himself, making reasonable doubt easier to plant. Some in the gallery murmured, it was textbook when DNA, physical evidence, and timeline all point to the defendant, create a second suspect, just enough to plant reasonable doubt. If that doubt took root, Pierce could walk. Halstead ended with, "You cannot convict one man when there is a real possibility someone else did it." He looked at the jury, trying to seed uncertainty, but the prosecution was ready. Lead prosecutor Elena Shepard was in no hurry. She walked to the lectern, placed her thick file down, and said, "I will show you not only that Foster could not be the perpetrator, but that he never came near any piece of evidence in this case." She projected a three-point timeline on screen: Maple Avenue, where Daniel's jacket was found in the wall, South Madison Street; soil match under Daniel's tires; Pierce's house, where the notebook and diary page were found. Then she said, "There is no record, no witness, no trace of Foster at any of these locations. Pierce, he appears at all three." Kane felt the shift in the jury box. People were leaning toward the prosecution. She held up the forensic report. "The touch DNA on Daniel's collar belongs to Leonard Pierce, not Foster. No match, no partial match, no possibility of error." A juror frowned. Halstead rubbed his chin, knowing touch DNA is nearly impossible to rebut. She continued, "The DNA isn't just on the collar, it's concentrated where someone would grip to pull from behind. This is not casual contact, this is control." She held up the report. "Touch DNA on Daniel's collar is Leonard Pierce's, not Foster. No match, no partial, no possibility of error." A juror frowned. Halstead rubbed his chin, knowing touch DNA is nearly impossible to rebut. She continued, "The DNA isn't just on the collar, it's concentrated where someone would grip to pull from behind. This is not casual contact, this is control." By the third piece of evidence, the prosecution delivered a blow that stopped the defense cold. Fiber and wall plaster analysis. Forensics confirmed. Fabric fibers from Daniel's jacket found along the brick seam at Maple Avenue contained traces of modern polymer mortar hidden after 1998. Foster died in 1991. Impossible for him to have concealed the jacket. Pierce was still living in St. Louis from 1998. 2003 timeline matches perfectly. Shepard said bluntly, "There is no scenario on Earth in which a man dead for 7 years plasters a wall with mortar that didn't exist until 1998. A long exhale came from the back of the room. Attorney Halstead bent to take notes, but it was clear the defense was weakening. She presented the mechanical evidence. The soil under Daniel's tires matches only the foundation dirt at the South Madison Street house, where Pierce did illegal wiring. Foster never set foot there. No rebuttal possible. The prosecution called the handwriting expert. Conclusion: 100% Pierce's handwriting. No second writer. Notes contemporaneous with Daniel's disappearance. Foster never even knew Daniel. Shepard looked straight at the jury. If this notebook belonged to Foster, how did it end up hidden inside Pierce's wall? No one in the courtroom had an answer. Attorney Halstead tried to appear confident, but he was clearly losing the battle of logic. Every forensic result, every timeline, every technical detail pointed to one man only: Pierce. One juror crossed his arms. Another shook his head slightly, as Shepard dissected the touch DNA. A third scribbled furiously, when the prosecution described the Maple Avenue hiding spot. These were not the reactions of people wavering. These were the reactions of people watching the picture become crystal clear. Shepard took one step closer, voice slow and deliberate. There is no second suspect. There is no other shadow except the one Pierce created to cover his own crimes. Every fiber, every grain of soil, every letter, every DNA sample leads to one person, and that person is sitting in front of you. She pointed directly at Pierce. He didn't just watch Daniel. He tricked him into getting in the truck. He took him to South Madison Street. He hid the boy's jacket in the wall after an innocent man was already dead. He tried to seal all of it away, but not tightly enough to bury 43 years of truth. No one in the room took a deeper breath after that final line. The verdict had not yet been read, but everyone inside knew what was happening. Pierce's desperate attempt to create a second suspect had been completely dismantled by forensics, timeline logic, and the tiny truths he thought he had buried forever. The shadow he built had vanished. Only one shadow remained, his own growing larger in the eyes of the jury, and there was no longer anywhere to run from it. As the trial reached its most intense point, and the prosecution systematically demolished every claim of a second suspect, a wave of shock swept through St. Louis and across Missouri. For many, the Daniel Whitford case had been nothing more than a vague old mystery they half remembered from 1980s news reports. But now, watching Leonard Pierce, a man they had seen at the corner store, mowing his lawn, fixing a neighbor's wiring, stand trial with mountains of evidence stacked against him, the feeling was more than shock. It was a community-wide chill. We lived next to him for 40 years, and never knew. Within 24 hours of Pierce's arrest going public, every Missouri news station led the hour with the same line: St. Louis cold case solved after 43 years. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran the front-page headline, "Pierce, the neighbor nobody suspected." Evening news programs devoted entire segments to dissecting the timeline, the forensics, the soil sample, the touch DNA, and especially the stalking notebook found inside his wall. Several criminologists said outright, that notebook wasn't written by someone who stumbled onto something. It is a target selection log. Local channels replayed clips of Daniel's family testimony, Raymond Ulrich's statement, and the jury's reactions when they heard about the torn diary page. A detail that triggered the strongest wave of online outrage in St. Louis history. Twitter and Facebook in Missouri exploded with hashtags, "Justice for Daniel Pierce Trial Missouri." Cold case people shared the last known photo of Daniel, the 20-year-old smiling in the picture taken just before he vanished, and called him the boy St. Louis forgot, until now. In live broadcasts, reporters went door to door in the neighborhoods where Pierce had lived for over 30 years. What sent chills through every viewer was the uniformity of emotion from residents, stunned, heartbroken, and unsettled to realize they had lived beside a predator in the dark. An elderly former neighbor, Lorraine Knight, now 82, choked up in front of the camera, "My God, I once asked him to change a light bulb for me. He was so quiet, so polite. We lived next to him, and never knew. We never knew." She broke down crying, trembling hands covering her mouth. Another resident, Dean Murray, who had hired Pierce to rewire his garage in 1999, stood shaking his head non-stop in front of the microphone. "I see Daniel's picture on TV. I look at Pierce again, and I can't believe it. How can a human being live that normally, for all those years, while hiding something that horrific?" Those words echoed across millions of screens, painting a picture no forensic slide ever could, the collective haunting of a community that had unknowingly shared streets with darkness. St. Louis looked at Daniel's family with a rare kind of reverence. 43 years without answers. 43 years waiting for a phone call, a knock on the door, a single piece of proof. 43 Christmases with an empty chair, birthdays without cake, and quiet nights that turned into the endless echo of one unanswered question: where is Daniel? Daniel's mother had passed away before the truth came out, but letters she left behind, read aloud on air, brought the entire state to tears. She wrote in 1995, I don't need to know who is to blame. I just need to know where my son is. I will keep asking. I will never give up. I owe him that." When Pierce's trial opened in 2024, Daniel's sister, now a woman in her 50s, sat in the front row clutching her brother's photo. When the prosecution presented the soil evidence leading to the house Pierce illegally wired, she sobbed out loud, "My mother waited her whole life. Today I'm waiting in her place." That sentence was shared hundreds of thousands of times across Missouri social media. It became the symbol of something unbreakable. The persistence of a victim's family is something that neither time, investigative mistakes, nor a killer's silence can ever extinguish. This was more than a case. The Daniel Whitford story became a mirror, forcing St. Louis to look back at an era full of chaos. No forensic science, handwritten reports easily lost, data entry errors that made Pierce's DNA invisible in the database for 25 years, a witness call misfiled under the wrong case, abandoned houses never fully searched, old-school detective thinking that trusted alibis without verification. Experts on KMOX radio said it plainly. Daniel's case isn't the failure of one person, it is the failure of an entire system. In citywide seminars, veteran investigators shared hard-won lessons: always re-interview witnesses, never fully trust an alibi unless it is independently verified. The smallest piece of evidence can be the key to the entire case. Next-generation forensics can crack cases once thought impossible. Never dismiss a civilian report, because Raymond's lost report changed everything, and one line appeared on every analysis broadcast: "If you see something wrong, speak up, and keep speaking until someone finally listens." Conversations spread across St. Louis. If Daniel had been found in 1981, Keith might still be alive. How could someone like Pierce live among us for 4 decades, and no one suspected? We misunderstood how safe our neighborhoods really were. Missouri police received dozens of calls about other old disappearances. Other families asked, could our case have a misfiled report like Daniel's? The surge forced the department to open a statewide cold case hotline. St. Louis had not been this united since the Great St. Louis Fire, a century earlier. But this time it wasn't real fire, it was the fire of truth and justice. The Daniel Whitford case did not merely expose one man's crimes, it exposed the cracks of an entire era. And though painful, the community understood, only by touching the wound can we learn to protect one another better. People placed flowers in front of Daniel's old house. They left notes: "We don't forget anymore." They taught their children to trust their instincts, to notice what feels wrong, to speak up. And they told one another, in the little diners along the Mississippi, if Daniel's family could wait 43 years, we can stay persistent for justice, for anyone. St. Louis had changed, and this story, however heartbreaking, became the city's largest conversation about truth, memory, and the responsibility a community carries when the past finally knocks. Right after Leonard Pierce's trial ended, and Missouri absorbed a community shock unlike any before, one question began spreading among investigators and citizens alike. If Pierce stalked Daniel and Keith, did he do it to anyone else? And that question was no longer curiosity, it became duty. An obligation the St. Louis Police Department could no longer avoid after 43 years of investigative gaps, file errors, and missed chances. So at the end of 2024, a historic decision was made: reopen every missing person, suspected abduction, and suspicious death file from 1978 to 1984 in the greater St. Louis area and surrounding counties. For decades, Missouri police had treated young male disappearances as isolated incidents, unless direct evidence linked them. But after the victim tracking notebook was found inside Pierce's wall, and after forensics proved he had stalked Daniel for weeks before striking, the task force realized they had been looking the wrong way for years. Daniel's case was not the only one. Keith Donner's was not the only one. They were not two separate crimes from the same period. They were bright dots demanding a search for a much larger pattern. Only when the map of disappearances from 1978-1984 was rebuilt did everyone gasp. 6 young men vanished within a 5-mile radius of places Pierce had worked. 3 victims never found, 2 once labeled possible runaways, and never deeply investigated. They were no longer isolated, they had become a pattern. And the pattern shared the same traits: all males aged 17–23, all vanished in the evening or late afternoon, all last seen near routes. Pierce regularly drove his truck or performed electrical jobs, none ever seen alive again. Those coincidences had once been scattered across thousands of pages. Only after Daniel's case were they finally stitched together into the shape of a predator who operated for years. When the prosecution presented the stalking notebook at trial, it was entered as evidence for 2 victims, Daniel and Keith. But when the task force examined it more closely after the trial, they discovered something far more frightening. Not just 2 names matched known victims. 3 additional names matched unsolved 1980s disappearances. T. Harris, vanished, 1980, night shift, never came home. MP, initials, believed to match Mark Pritchard, missing 1983. Ben, a name with a question mark, matching a thinly documented 1979 missing person report. Police had once thought those cases were unrelated. Now they understood Pierce had been watching them long before he acted. That notebook wasn't just a list, it was the blueprint of a series. And the task force began matching every note to real locations. Which route matched Harris's bus line, shift end time matched Mark Pritchard's schedule. Usually walks alone on Mondays, matched Ben Garner's routine near Greenleah Park. For the first time St. Louis faced a chilling possibility. Daniel and Keith were only the 2 victims who had been discovered. But not the first 2. And possibly not the last 2. Dozens of old files were pulled together. Clothing fragments, fabric scraps, hair, soil, once deemed worthless by 1980s forensic standards, were sent for modern reanalysis. 2024 technology allowed touch DNA on decades-old, degraded items, geological soil comparison against current maps, microtrace analysis, fibers, minerals, ink analysis to trace notebook entries, AI forensic timeline, reconstruction, data recovery from scanned old maps. One item from the T. Harris case, a shredded shirt remnant left by animals in the woods in 1980, was retested, and for the first time traces of modern polymer mortar were found on the thread. The exact mortar forensic linked to off-the-books jobs Pierce did in the early 1990s. If true, it meant the shirt had been handled or exposed to the same material Pierce used. Even though Harris disappeared more than a year before Daniel. One forensic technician said a line that silenced the room: "We're not just solving Daniel's case, we're opening the door to cases no one ever even looked for a killer in." Missouri police understood that what happened to Daniel was tragedy, but what they could no longer deny was this: Daniel's case saved many other cases. The mistakes of the 1981 investigation, lost reports, unverified alibis, missing hair evidence, incorrectly formatted DNA that stayed invisible for 25 years, became living lessons for every new probe. And the St. Louis demanded answers. How many more victims did Pierce have? No one dared guess the number. No one dared speculate. But patterns don't lie. The notebook doesn't lie. And forensics for the first time could do what the 1980s could not: speak for the victims who no longer had a voice. At the 2025 press conference, a female forensic technician said a line that silenced the entire room: the 1980s had no tools to catch him. But justice has time, and time always stands on the side of truth. Daniel vanished in 1981. The jacket was hidden in the wall sometime between 1999 and 2003. Pierce's DNA was entered incorrectly in 1998. The witness report that went missing in 1981 was found in 2024. All those mistakes, like layers of dust, were swept away by modern forensics, and when the dust cleared, Pierce's portrait stood fully revealed. St. Louis entered 2025 with a new awareness. They were not just the place where a crime happened, they were the place that dared to face a crime even after half a lifetime had passed. Daniel's cold case now became the driving force for dozens of other families. Every 1978, 1984 file was reopened for the first time in full. Forensic labs received double the funding. The University of Missouri, launched a new forensic training program called the Whitford Initiative. People said, "Daniel didn't live to see this, but because of him, others will be found." And that is the true legacy of this case. Not just the sentence handed to one predator, not just the relief for the victims' families, not just the community's sigh after 43 years of dodging the dark, but an unbreakable truth. When truth is buried in a wall, forensics will dig it up. When memory fades, the community will remember. When someone disappears, the search continues. Whether for 1 year or 40, Daniel Whitford was never found, but the relentless search for him dragged light deep into 4 decades of St. Louis darkness, and in the end, that light led not only to one killer, but to the chance for other victims to be seen again for the first time in decades. That is the end of Daniel's story, but the beginning of a new chapter for justice in St. Louis. Looking back at the Daniel Whitford case in the light of today's America, what is terrifying is not only that someone like Leonard Pierce could exist for 40 years without detection, but that so many ordinary gaps in everyday life unwittingly protected him. A long-haul driver's report misfiled in 1981, a lost hair sample, Pierce's DNA entered in the wrong format in 1998, Daniel's UMSL jacket, sealed behind plaster in a Maple Avenue wall. These are very specific details in the story, yet they reflect a broader reality across the United States. If systems are not constantly checked, updated and questioned, small errors can stretch into decades-long tragedies. On the flip side, it was the people who never gave up, who truly drove justice forward. Daniel's family calling, keeping records, saying his name for 43 years, a young forensic tech like Nadia, refusing to accept no match found, and manually rechecking Pierce's DNA file. Geology professor Bowditch, patiently analyzing the soil stuck to the tires. Raymond refusing to stay silent, and calling again in 2024, to repeat what he saw. In today's American life, the real lesson is not believe everything is always fair, but the opposite, actively ask questions, keep records, dare to report anything unusual, dare to chase answers to the end, for yourself and for your community. And when the system fails, as St. Louis courageously admitted its 1980s investigative shortcomings and reopened the entire 1978-1984 period, that too is a very American reminder. Justice is not perfect, but it can get better if we dare to face it, fix mistakes, and never let another Daniel be forgotten. If you believe stories like Daniel Whitford's deserve to see the light, hit subscribe to walk with us on this journey for truth. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue unraveling the unsolved mysteries of America.